Welcome, everybody. As you start coming in, we'll take a few moments to get settled here, and then we'll get everything kicked off. Thanks for joining us today. All right. We're at 12:02 right now, Wisconsin time. So either good morning or good afternoon to wherever you are joining us from today. I really appreciate you all taking the time to join me and the two wonderful nonprofit leaders that are going to be talking about how they build strategic culture within their organizations today. So before we really jump into the conversation, I wanted to introduce myself, give you a little bit more understanding of Spectrum Nonprofit Services approach to strategy, and then talk about that in the context of building a strategic culture. So really going from the building of a strategic plan to the implementation of it within your organization. So my name is Maggie Corry. I'm a strategy consultant with Spectrum Nonprofit Services. We are a consulting firm based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, but work nationally with all different kinds of nonprofit organizations, from their nascency and really building organizational capacity and understanding of the work that they want to do, and then working with very mature organizations that are looking to adapt to external forces, to think about how they really, charge themselves with the impact they seek to achieve and build sustainability for the organization. So we work with all kinds of nonprofit organizations, and I really hope that today in our discussion it helps shed some light in the work that you do personally. Before we really dive into things, I just wanted to start getting a sense of who's joining us today and your perspective on what how you look at your organization's culture, and whether you think it really comes from a strategic approach, or if you're really working through the day-to-day of all the day-to-day work that you have to do. Just get an understanding of how you think about your work. So I'm going to quickly launch a poll here, asking you to rate your level of agreement with this statement, saying that your culture balances long-term strategic work with the day-to-day operations of your organization. Give you a few moments here. Happy to see that we have almost 40 people joining us today. So we're getting close to 100% participation, and then I'll shut that down. So when you're thinking about your culture, and when you're talking, answering this this prompt, really thinking about culture in the way that your organization makes decisions, the way that you talk about the impact that you seek to achieve, the way you talk about the financial sustainability of your organization, thinking about, are there plans around that? Are there discussions around that? How do you learn as an organization together? Those are really things that are components of an organization's culture, and how strategy gets built out through them on a day-to-day basis. So let's see, looking at this, we have the majority of you say, the largest percentage, 36%, say that you agree that your organization does do a good job at balancing the strategic with the day-to-day operations, with the next greatest amount saying that you're neutral. So there's some room there, which is why you joined us today. We really want to learn from the best and the brightest who are joining us today, to think about what are ways that you can strengthen your strategic approach as an organization. So thank you for sharing your perspective there. I mentioned that we really want to ground ourselves in the idea of what strategy looks like before we talk about how it really gets lived out through the day-to-day and implemented within an organization. So we always like to use this very simple but true illustration of, I think it really captures nonprofit work. It captures both the act of strategic planning. You get into a process and you think it's going to be really linear, and you think you're going to get to a certain point, but we know that it's never the case. And that's the same with the work that an organization does as it seeks to achieve its mission. We really think that if we put all the right pieces in place, it's going to be smooth sailing, and here we go off into the sunset achieving our mission. But as leaders of nonprofit organizations, as people that are involved in the day-to-day work, we know that there's a really messy middle. And I think knowing and being okay with that, and being uncomfortable with it, but okay with it, I think is really important as you look at how you work with your staff and how you work with other people to do your organization's work. So this again is, if this resonates with you, then you're in good company. And today what we're going to talk through is kind of that messy middle, like how are we working with the people that believe in the organization's mission? How are we working with them to get them through this messy middle? Secondly, the idea of strategy. We really at Spectrum really come from this idea, this concept of adaptive strategy, as opposed to giving really prescriptive, long planning lists of how an organization is going to strengthen its work. We have learned both over the last disruptive 3 years and through all of the work with nonprofits, that nonprofits can put great plans into place, but there's constantly changing environments externally and internally. And as those things shift, we have to have the ability to think about what's really driving our work and how do we keep all of that on track to adapt to the external and internal changes. So we like to look at this pretty simple diagram that's the kind of inner larger circle of ongoing decision-making, execution, and learning. That's the day-to-day operations of an organization. But you can continue to build strategic thinking within that ongoing decision-making, execution, and learning, while you can build in periodic planning, which is typically a strategic plan, and that then informs the work going forward. So that, really, again, thinking through as we have our discussions today of this idea of adaptive strategy, that wonderful plans can be put in place, but it's really making sure that there's the capacity within the organization, and you as a leader are stewarding your team to drive towards really to drive towards the work that's going to build your organization's impact and financial sustainability. And before we jump in to meeting our lovely panelists today, this is a final illustration of how we really like to approach our work. This idea of the interconnectedness between an organization's impact, your financial sustainability, the revenue drivers, and then finally the people. And so, people in both the people that we serve as organizations, and of course the people that make all of the work happen on the ground through leadership, through the board. So today we're diving into this idea of building culture, so the people side of things, and how we make sure that our organizations are ready to make intelligent, informed strategic decisions as changes happen for the organization. So we're joined today by Maggey Oplinger, who is the General Director and CEO of the Florentine Opera Company here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, who will be coming up in just a short time on around, I think, 100 years eventually of being in existence. And then Mike Mitchell, who's the Executive Director of CelticMKE, which is the home of Milwaukee's Irish Fest, which is the world's largest celebration of Celtic cultures. And so I wanted to mention some commonalities between these two organizations, but then there are some distinct differences too. And I think it'll be helpful in thinking through how they approach their work. But one thing that I've really seen in knowing both Maggey and Mike and leading these organizations is not only are they leading performing arts events-based organizations through the pandemic, which disproportionately affected arts and culture organizations and changed the way that programs could be delivered. I mean, that's a significant commonality, but they're also working with organizations that have important legacies within the community they serve and have some often, what would be considered in the past traditional approaches to things. But what I think is really great is that both Mike and Maggey have thought about how the organizations have, evolved out of these traditions, still paying respect to them, still honoring them, but evolving the organizations to make sure that their mission continues to be relevant in today's society. So they're balancing both the evolution through the COVID-19 pandemic, but also the evolution of the organizations through their traditions. So I'm really just grateful for both of you to be here today and excited to hear what you have to say, the successes you found, the challenges that you faced. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it off with Maggey Oplinger of the Florentine Opera. So Maggey, we think about this, again, this idea of the messy middle, right? And we think about having to balance this strategic long-term thinking for an organization with the day-to-day of running a nonprofit. Talk to me a little bit how you work to balance the day-to-day priorities with your strategic objectives.
First of all, I'm delighted to be here. So thank you, Maggie. I think we're going to have a lot of fun today. One of the first things I start with is the immediate fires that need to be put out. And that sounds a little emergency reactive focused, but I don't feel like anyone can enter into a conversation around planning if, they've got a dumpster fire on their desk. So in the same phase where we kind of do a temp check at work, we're doing the temp check with the board and donors as well. And that, first of all, gives a really good context around what is the most dramatic challenge we're facing as an organization for right now. And how does that tie to what might be coming down the pike a little bit later? And while you're having those conversations, some of the side information I'm gathering is how comfortable are people as we talk about change or looking for slight tweaks to our process, or whether we need a very big dramatic shift? Do they see that too? I think it's very easy in our roles to, we practice so much long-term vision, and we are, in these positions of leadership because we look at things from a very high level. And unless we're looking at them with everybody else, we can make a whole lot of change, but no one's coming with us. So then you're not really accomplishing anything. I had, as I'm sure many other organizations did, but an opera company has two halves. We have the people who actually make opera on stage and hire performers and manage performers in the orchestra and music and rehearsals. And then we have our administrative team, and that one looks a lot more like other organizations with marketing and fundraising and education initiatives. And putting those two pieces together kind of sometimes feels like I'm running two different organizations, because where they are in those conversations can often be completely unrelated, in the same way that many of our board experiences might be completely unrelated to where the staff is. So I had a really interesting year last year, because on my admin side, we had 100% turnover, which was very exciting. And we are not an enormous administrative team, even though we do enormous shows on stage. And one of the things I took out of that experience, and there's been a couple, and I'll be sharing those, I think, throughout the day. It was a very good learning experience for me, I say now. But as we were looking at it, it was like, how do we embrace all of these new viewpoints and indoctrinate all of these new high energy people into an environment, a company that's 90 years old, with an existing board and donor base and audience base and other team members who have a lot more experience with this specific company, and not lose that energy, but still get the work done and capture the good ideas, but filter them. And so one of the big things we do once we got that sense, and I will tell you those interest levels and change very dramatically, was what is something that we should be talking about right now versus what is something that we should put in the parking lot, as that's a great idea. It's not a right now idea. It might be a 6 months from now idea. It might be a 10 years from now idea. We might end up deciding it's not the right idea for us. But having a place where you can put stuff that feels exciting and has some momentum behind it, but that you can't tackle right in that moment. I also talk a lot about slowing down to speed up. Again, I learned a lot of my lessons the hard way. I learned that one the hard way. But when you do have a lot of new people marrying old companies, old traditions, people who have a lot more experience in the space, some of those really good ideas around what should feel like a quick fix for something often aren't. There's often a very good reason why that quick fix has not been executed yet. And if you take the time to walk people through some of that rationale, rather than just saying no, or rather than saying yes, God help you, and finding a way to use the topic to move things forward as a group and get everyone onto a place where they all can kind of see where the other teammates are coming from, I have found really connected us and gave us a chance to start to build out some strategic ideas with that elasticity around the fires are for today so that we can have this conversation tomorrow. And it just gave us a starting point, I think, as we were yo-yoing through change to really position that well. I could go on, but I'd love to hear what Mike has to say.
And I love that idea, right, of the using the challenges, using the strategic goals to, organizational change has to be managed. But to really use that as the rallying point, I think is really a great takeaway from that. And I thought, Meg, it was interesting that you called out, you said you feel like sometimes you're holding two separate parts of the organization at the same time. And Mike, something I wanted to talk to you about. So Mike and I went through a planning process with CelticMKE together. And so I got to see this all in action. But CelticMKE has a significant volunteer base. I mean, a very large dedicated volunteer corps that allows the work to get done, in addition to a small but mighty staff. So one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, Mike, is like, sometimes adaptive strategy, and with it being like, we're going to react to the external, we worry that we don't want to let it scatter people, especially with volunteers who might not be so tied to the organization all the time. But I think you've really done a wonderful job at leveraging that people power as opposed to letting it get scattered. So can you talk to me a little bit, Mike, about how you've approached, pulling in volunteers along with the staff in service of your strategic direction?
Well, I really just wanted to say ditto to what Maggie said, because I think that everything she said was spot on, and could be repeated for everything we do. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I really appreciate it. We're a unique organization, or at least I like to think we're a unique organization. We started off being a festival. Started very small and built up to be the world's largest Irish music festival with over 4,000 volunteers involved in it. What happened, though, is that as we were growing and as the years went by, the forefathers were wise enough and smart enough to say, we need to be more than just a festival. We need to be a cultural organization that's really kind of educating and preserving the culture and the heritage, and really helping people so that they can carry on the culture and the heritage for 40 more years beyond today. So we kind of emerged into becoming a year-round organization involved in preserving and promoting the culture and heritage. And we put on an annual fundraising event each year now called Milwaukee Irish Fest. And it's a backwards way of getting to where we are today. But quite frankly, it's a blessing to have the opportunity to have 100,000 plus people come and help celebrate our annual fundraising event. I'm sure everybody else would love to have that as their annual fundraising event. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, and I think to that point is that you're really thinking about, like, it was led with impact, right? Like that shift was really led with the impact that you wanted to continue to have, but you understood that your community needed more out of the organization.
That's correct. And to your question, we had 4,000 plus volunteers, and more importantly, probably about 200 to 300 leadership volunteers who really enjoyed what they created, enjoyed having this festival and that being what we are. And they had to be carried into what the future of the organization was, and the fact that festivals may not last forever, but we want to be able to still promote and preserve this culture and heritage. And so we had to bring them along, if you will. And that was a unique situation when we started working with you and Steve and Spectrum, because our leadership are very familiar with the old traditional strategic plan process. And this is different. This is something that is forever changing, forever growing, and forever moving with your organization, which is doing the same. And so it's a different approach. And there was pushback in the beginning from our leadership because they didn't quite understand the approach. And we had to slowly educate them and teach them about what the process is and why the process will work. And now they look back in hindsight and they say, wow, this is phenomenal. And I'm glad that we didn't just throw in the towel in the beginning, but in fact gave it the chance and see the future and the potential of it. So bringing the leadership, bringing 4,000 volunteers to understand what we're trying to do, what we are today, and to have them involved in defining what we're going to be in the future was important. I think one of the things that happened when I first met with Steve and we started talking about utilizing your firm to help with a strategic plan, he put constraints on me right off the bat. And I was a little pushed back by it, but wanted to be open-minded. He said, let's build a small team of your strategic plan leadership team. And I only want to have one historian, one person who can talk about what your organization's done over the past 40 years. I want to have the future leadership, the young people that you want to carry forward for the next 40 years. I want them to be a part of defining what the strategic plan is. I want them to be feel ownership in it and feel that they can carry it forward. And so that was a little bit different. And people who I had asked to be on the strategic plan early in the process, I had to ask them now not to be, because we were restructuring to be more of our future leaders. And it has worked very well doing that. And now that we've got the initial plan done and we have subgroups that are identifying each of our targets, I put the same constraints on those subgroups, saying I want, one historian, but I want the future leaders involved so that we get that buy-in, that build up. We're carrying our next generation of leadership forward with this.
Thank you, Mike.
Mike,
And
do
I
you
think
feel like that gets, I'm so sorry, I'm jumping in, I apologize. Do you feel like that gets the veterans excited? Because I feel like, especially with organizations like ours, very built in history, that sometimes the same people I was worried would be offended, they aren't at the table. They get so excited about the next generation that it almost carries the weight for you.
So it's a great question, Maggie, and I have to be honest. There are a handful of our original founders, a handful of our original leadership that were upset that they weren't being a part of the process, that they were cast aside, if you will. And that wasn't the case, and it took a lot of discussion with them. But then there was much more of the leadership that said, this makes sense. And where we were almost a cliquish organization from some regards, this is going to grow us out of that, and it's going to grow us to be able to be much more long-term. And so, yes, there was pushback, but a lot of the pushback can be resolved with communications and educating and just making them aware of, they're not being cast off. They're not going to be uninvolved entirely. They're going to be involved, but not in the initial phase. And we want them to sit back and allow some of the younger people to have a voice, which sometimes doesn't happen in our organizations.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing that both of you talked about was this idea of turnover, and it's in two different contexts, right? Maggie, you talked about that your administrative team had significant turnover, which I know a lot of organizations are experiencing, and that the job market is difficult to get really quality people that you can afford, right? And Mike, in Mike's case, Mike will be there's a succession plan happening with the eventual executive director, a very long-term 3-year, but she is able to come up and see what's happening and follow the strategy along. Maggie, when we first kind of started talking about ideas around this, you talked about a tool that you've pulled together to help ground the admin staff and your leadership staff in its work to build that institutional knowledge around the strategies in the long-term vision for the organization. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I will, and I also want to do a little hat nod to Spectrum, because this started with a tool that you guys, I think, kind of created for us. And I appreciated, to Mike's point, the flexibility of, okay, we're going to listen to where you're trying to get to, and then figure out, kind of come back a step and figure out what needs to happen. Because when I started in March of 2019, which is hilarious timing. And we we had a lot happening. There was a lot in flux, in change, and we were mid-season. So opera tends to run with their big shows from September through May. And so March is a really wild time to just kind of jump in. And we had an opera starting. I went to my first rehearsal for my first show on day 2. So I didn't even know the people who worked with me, much less all of the artists. We bring in about 200 people per show. And, in that moment, it was like, how do I build a long-term strategic plan for a company that I'm still learning and that is in such a state of transition? And the first piece of like my critical tool set right now was this. We ended up making it about a 5-year, and honestly, I keep extending it because it's awesome. I'm calling it a 7-year now, strategic playbook. And we intentionally were like, we are not doing a 20-page deep dive, massive research, huge retreats kind of a plan. We didn't have the time to do that because we were in the burning fire stage. And Mike, to your point, I was like, okay, there's all these specific people I'm going to need to bring in, and let me get that list together. I'll get invites out. And he caught me on the way in. It was great. He's like, nope. Same thing. Let's have kind of one representative of each of these types in the organization participate. And over a couple of months, we came up with this single page that's kind of like our cheat sheet game plan for what the Florentine is trying to do. And for me, it goes perfectly with our mission, vision, and values slide. I give those 2 pieces to almost anyone who wants to know what the Florentine is trying to do. And we added one piece that I call the yardstick, and that's kind of our funnel. And we pick 3 things we're trying to focus on every year as a team. I build that out with my leadership team. And it can be anything from, we need to update all of our systems, which we actually kept for 2 years because it took us that long, but it was huge, to building community can be one, so that yardstick funnel is really about any initiatives that we greenlight. So say we pull something off the parking lot, has to hit at least one of those, or we shouldn't be doing it right now. Because sometimes those plans can be so awesome, but they're so comprehensive. You can go down a rabbit hole on one bullet point in a 20-page strategic plan and not come up for air for another 18 months. So our playbook is very specific. It took us a lot to grind down to those few words, but we talk about it all the time. And to me, that makes it an effective tool. And as I was looking at this whole administrative team shift, which of course did not happen tidily on one day, that would have been great. But we tried to look at when we were bringing on groups of people and built a series of just like major, sit everyone down, get everyone lunch, have a conversation with homework, almost like little strategic mini sessions for about 2 hours. And we didn't try to do everything in each session, which was kind of where I'd started. We decided to turn them, I called them boot camps. We did one around identity, and we talked about our strategy and our brand. And our brand is more than what we look like on our website, right? Our brand is our voice. It's the feel and look of what it feels like to do anything with the Florentine as an audience member, as a donor. We did that in one 2-hour session, and I gave them like 3 documents that were pretty chock full to do beforehand. So what we didn't want to do was read to them. And then for 2 hours, we gave the team the floor and said, what did you like? What do you not get? What doesn't seem to make sense with where we are? How does this tie to what you're trying to do in your role as you get here and you step into the Florentine? And we had these really engaging conversations that, frankly, I took a lot away from as well, in terms of what resonates easily and what needs a lot of explanation, because then I've got to work on that for myself to make sure it's more digestible as we're bringing other people on. We did one around our document sharing system. We did one around opera as an art form, because we have a very niche art form. Only 1.6% of arts attending audience members in this country come to opera. So we are niche, which I delighted in sharing with Spectrum, because they then were like, we're not even doing geographic reach. And I'm like, correct. if you're in San Diego and you want to see one of our shows, come on over. But I was really excited to see that as we built these out and we shared them with the team and we spaced them out, we didn't do 3 in a row. We did like 1 a month for 3 months, which made me impatient because I wanted everybody to know all the stuff, but it can't get in that fast. And we had a team member join us the last one in January. And I looked at the leadership group and I said, well, how are we going to tackle this? Because I can't do a boot camp for one person. And I have never been more delighted in my life because they looked at me collectively and said, we'd actually love to redo a boot camp, because they'd been in their roles then for about 6 to 8 months. And we're like, now this all seems more meaningful. Can we just do a quick refresher? So I can see us using that model, just like that, 2-hour quick but focused time together with homework in the future, as we like right now we're building out our strategic goals for the year, and we're coming back to that playbook a lot. And I could see us having another boot camp around, here's what every team wants to tackle and how do they fit together. So I get very excited about that one.
Well, and
it was very meaningful.
Other people are excited about it too, because Jessica asked in the Q&A of that idea of potentially sharing the playbook. But I think one of the things that Maggie, there's probably some very detailed information there, but I think one of the things that Maggie, you talked about, and work that we did also with CelticMKE, is this concept of an impact strategy, which is like a theory, essentially a logic model and theory of change. So Jessica, I'm happy to share that out after the webinar. When we send follow-up materials, we can send over some information about what that looks like and how that idea of having like a one-sheeter allows you to drive the work forward. So thank you for asking that, Jessica. I want to make sure we get one more question to Mike, and then we are going to jump into, I want to kind of bring it all together and talk about key takeaways, and then offer the opportunity for the audience members to ask a few questions if there are any. So
hard to believe we're already 30 minutes into this.
We knew
just gabbing away.
We knew this group would be okay. Really hard time. But also that I have a full page of takeaways. So Mike, this is just a kind of general question here, but you talked through some of the barriers, right, within your organization of, bringing people along and making sure people understood the expectations and making sure there was representation. What are some other challenges? And you're really in the thick of implementing your strategic direction right now, but what are some other challenges that you've come across that, you don't necessarily have to have a solution to it, but are good to be aware of?
Oh, I think one of the big challenges is like the second slide that you showed with all the scribbly lines that are there. We put on this little festival with 100,000 of our closest friends every year in August, and you stop suddenly thinking about what's the future and let's start strategic planning and all that, and you're into what we call festival mode, and we're busy getting ready for something, and everybody's mind has now shifted to that. So one of the struggles is getting them back on track and thinking about what we're doing and how we want to do it. And Maggie brought up an interesting thing, and that's this playbook that she referred to, on a one-page playbook yet, I'll add. And I think that's great, because as we are meeting with our volunteers preparing for the festival, it's an opportunity for me to educate all of them on, well, here's the 4 goals, here's what we're accomplishing so far on goal 1. And when we get back together again 2 weeks from now and we're talking about something else for the festival, I'll tell you what goal 2 is and what progress we're making on that. And that's getting that buy-in. That's getting these people to be a part of the process at that point.
Thank you.
What I'm hearing from you, Mike, is your way of working with your volunteers is very much how we have to work with all of our artists who only come in for a short time. And I hadn't thought about it that way. So I'm taking some of this back too. I'm like, I haven't done that with performers. That's a good idea.
Well, and one of the points that Maggie brought up earlier, and I just wanted to really quickly throw out there, is the succession planning. And succession planning is critical. And one of the things that came out of our strategic planning with Spectrum was start early and think about it in depth. And so we identified who my replacement was going to be. Our board's already met and has made the decision on who it's going to be in 2 years. And we decided who the festival director is going to be and to start that in 1 year. So now we're scheduling it so that we don't have, so that we have overlap, so that we continue to have that institutional knowledge, but we're really thinking about it and identifying it and moving it forward early in the game. Sorry, I had to throw that out there.
I love it.
Love it.
Thank you. Well, it was great to hear from both of you. And I think, when we talk about our approach of adaptive strategy, one of the most important things about adaptive strategy is always learning, right? Like having a culture within an organization saying, okay, we have these ideas in place. We think this is how we're going to move our work forward, but it's a hypothesis until it's really being done. And so as you're implementing it, bringing the information back and not only having the leader being the one informing what's learning, but really bringing voices together to ask, what are you learning from this? How are you experiencing this? I think is really important. So thinking through all the layers of the organization, making sure that if you're having a group of people that are pushing together, putting, that periodic planning together, or really looking at that to make sure it's representative of what the organization is and seeks to be, to making, not only to make sure the voices are included, but to build buy-in and to build understanding that will get spread through the organization. I think a few different times there are these ideas of having tools or what we like to call strategy screens. So questions that you ask or filters through which you ask strategic questions and determine whether or not that's something the organization is going to pursue ever immediately. How do you prioritize it? And this is all done, of course, within the context of putting out those fires. But what I also hear is that there's always going to be the fires to put out, and it's exhausting, and your work is hard, and bringing people along for it is a big effort. But doing that planning, even in bite-sized pieces, allows you to understand what are the actual fires, right? Because everything's going to feel like a fire if you don't have a strategic direction in front of you. So I appreciate, and we had talked through the questions, but we hadn't talked through the answers necessarily. And so I appreciate seeing those common themes come out. But really also that idea of it's not just bringing people along so there's buy-in, but like you're going to make the best decisions possible if you have more voices, and it's worth the effort in bringing those voices along, even when it's 4,000 volunteers and artists and people turning over. So I just really, appreciate that, both of your perspectives and getting to learn from your experiences. We have a few minutes left here, and I would like to invite anybody here attending to share any questions that they might have. There is the option to share a question within the Q&A, and then I will pose it to our panelists, and hopefully we'll get those answered.
While you're typing, I just want to add to that one thing I was thinking about while you were talking, Maggie, because it ties into it. One of the other things I've loved about this is getting to, number one, as a leader coming into an organization with a long history, which both of us have, also being able to show, look, we have an intention and we made a game plan and we followed it. So there's a lot of kind of building camaraderie and then celebrating those successes that can also come out of working right out of that playbook or whatever strategic structure people have. And that's something I have really valued, especially coming out of COVID, because every success was so hard won and still kind of feels that way, that getting to actually look at a piece of paper and go, here's what we talked about, here's what we really wanted to do. And even though parts of this year have felt hard, look what we pulled off together has felt amazing. So we use it in that way too.
And if I could just add to that, it's important to have that plan and to follow through on the plan, but it's also important to be flexible and learn as you're going and adjust and make the plan work for you.
Yes.
All right, we got Alexia with a question saying thank you for your discussion. And there's the question from Alexia is this idea, you both have really long-standing organizations, and we talked about kind of that evolution of how you pulled the organizations through that evolution. But wondering if there's any particular advice for an organization that's smaller, more in the startup phase, and how you might see there being like a difference in approach for us, a burgeoning organization. Either one of you.
The one thing I would encourage you to do is to get whatever team you have. Most of us are nonprofits. We have volunteers involved with us. Get them involved. Get them to be a part of the solution, and start that early. The second thing is reach out to other organizations and learn best practices. Become a partner with another nonprofit that may be in a similar area as yours, and become best friends and learn from each other, talk to each other, have coffee once in a while. Use them as a sounding board for ideas and thoughts.
I love that. My background is strangely in the arts and in corporate innovation, which is unusual, but very helpful. And I worked through, I was called a catalyst, using design thinking as a framework. And it's a great framework, I think, that really fits small organizations, because it's all about doing things in bite-sized pieces and asking the right questions. And one of the most challenging steps in that process is framing the question, or framing the challenge, or framing the mission. And I think really focusing in on what you're trying to accomplish will help you fight scope creep. And because so many missions tie to so many other missions, it's really easy to think we're going to add this too, and there might be funding attached to it, or it might resonate with one particular member of your team who wants to tackle that. I think the best thing you can do for a startup, younger organization is to really ground yourself in your core sense of purpose, and you will grow. Like, if you can really frame that out and your mission is strong and easily communicated, and you can build out that infrastructure for what you're trying to accomplish, the growing will come. So this is that slow down to speed up. Frame your question and then guard it with your life, because it's very easy to expand.
Alexia has gratitude for both of you and says, keep preaching the small steps and keeping focus. Stick to what we're good at. So understanding what you're strong, the core competencies, and where you need to strengthen your organization to lift yourself up to that level of impact that you seek to achieve. But I really do agree. It's the building community around what you want to do, and the being able to articulate your impact to the community that you're having, and things will come along with it. But bringing that back around into regular conversation, I think both Maggie and Mike spoke to moments of, there's annual planning, right? And the budgeting process is a really great opportunity for organizations to have some of these discussions if you're not having them yet, because budgeting is already a strategic issue. And so making sure that other conversations are being had around that time, and then finding other bite-sized opportunities, whether it's you put it into regularly, or there's something that you say, oh, this triggers us into having a strategic conversation. I think really thinking about how that fits into your annual and ongoing planning cycles is important, and being okay and being ready to take risks, calculated risks, I think, but then making sure when you take those calculated risks, that you learn from them and you have discussion around what you learned. We have
Having a mentality around being an entrepreneur is something that is really important. For especially that smaller startup nonprofit. You're going into it as an entrepreneur. You got to have that entrepreneur mentality, but you also have to have an understanding that it's better to partner with people than to try to shove them away. A lot of organizations, what they do is they feel that similar organizations, similar nonprofits are the competitor, that you're both trying to get those dollars from donors and grants from the same people. But quite frankly, donors and grantors want to see partnerships. They want to see people working together. They would rather fund a partnership of two organizations with the same mission than one who's not working with the other.
Scaling your impact appropriately. Yeah. We have time for one more question. We have one from Talisha, and I think this is, I would say, goes to what Maggie, you were talking about. How do you support the team in understanding the slowing down will help us speed up? How do you communicate that to the team?
It's hard. So I understand why you're asking the question. I have two methods. One is just a brutal, I'm going to put this in the parking lot and we'll talk about it later, which usually that's the most eager, like we can tackle it all at one time people, where I'm like, nope, we are not tackling. I remove this from your plate. But then it has to have a follow-up conversation, usually a couple of months later, where we'll sit down. And my parking lot is a visual parking lot. I have a huge glass board in my office covered in Post-it notes. So when I say this, it is there for all of us to look at. And I'll say, hey, remember when we really wanted to tackle this a few months ago and I felt like it wasn't the right time? This is why. And usually at that point in time, they've gone deeper into a project, or they've, started a different part of their job cycle that they didn't see coming. And that's our job, is to see that for them. So that's the hardest one, because you feel really mean, but it's usually for a very good reason. The second one, and this one I like so much better, is for a teammate to do that for me. So I like to have those conversations with my leadership group or in a staff meeting. And then if I say, hey, is this a right now or a parking lot, have that be a conversation. And you have to temp check whether that's the right fit for your organization or not. But once you've got people who've gone through that experience on their own a couple of times, our cycle at the opera, for example, is about 18 months long between when we decide to do a show and it hits our stage. So a lot of times, if we make a change, it will be for 1.5 years to 2 years out. So for example, right now, adjustments we're making to strategy will hit our 24-25 season. You won't see them next year. And when we talk to new teammates about why we do that, instead of trying to rush something into effect for the coming season, I like to give very specific examples. And I just keep a couple in my back pocket of, hey, we tried to hurry up and do this, and then we didn't get to lay the proper groundwork, and we didn't have the right timeline for the audience to find out about it. And we built something really amazing, but nobody was there to enjoy it. That's a great way to just give a really concrete example of, this isn't a shutdown. This is let's get the right runway in place to have the conversation. And then I think also celebrating when you've pulled something off the parking lot list and put it into play is a great way to remind people that this isn't a circular file. This isn't you chucking their ideas and never coming back to it. It really is a place where you make sure you're doing things in the right time frame.
Well said.
I want to put a little plug out here. If you enjoyed your time attending this, which it would be hard not to enjoy your time, I think, and learn something. But wanted to just mention that this is an ongoing, we have 2 more parts of this webinar series. So we talked today about the idea of like staff and operational volunteers. We will be having another discussion, and you'll, if you're on the email list, you'll receive more information about working with your board to set you up for success for strategic implementation. And then there will be another and the final one about moving from planning to implementation, understanding the true costs of your nonprofit programming. So once you have a plan in place, what does it really look like financially? So I encourage you to join these as they are shared. They'll be coming up in the next few months, but I just want to share my deepest gratitude to Mike and Maggie and everybody who attended and asked questions and helped us have this conversation today, because I know it's a really important one to have. And we'll make sure to send everybody some follow-up materials. I know there was some interest in that idea of that, the kind of 1-pager, the impact strategy, the playbook. So just thank you for your wisdom and your discussion today. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Take care.